Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekend reading report. It's time for my weekend reading report where I talk about all the exciting stuff that I read during the previous week. And I did read a couple of things. Again, another busy week, but I did read some stuff. And my little dog Rhonda seems to be recovering very well from surgery, and she no longer has to wear a silly donut over her head or around her neck. So, that's good. That makes her happy. So hopefully this month coming up, will be better. I guess this is the very last day of March. How about that? The end of March. Man, this year is going by quick. Huh. Anyway, I did read some stuff this past week. So let's talk about it. Okay. In my 500 book challenge, the challenge where I have to read 500 books that I own before I will buy any new ones. What number did I? Okay, so I finished book number 118. 118. And that was this book. This is Thor, A Kingdom Lost. A Kingdom Lost. This is Thor Epic Collection Volume 11, which has Thor stories from 1981 through 1982. Not my favorite period of Thor, although it does have some good artwork in it by Keith Pollard. So, I am reading every single issue of Thor from the first run of Thor, which ran from the early 1960s until the mid-1990s. And these stories are pretty much my least favorite so far since, well, the first Epic Collection, since the very beginning. When Thor first started out, it was a little rocky. It took a while for Thor to become really cool. But some of these stories, Doug Moench writes a lot of these stories, and Doug Moench is usually a pretty good comic book writer. But I don't know, his run on Thor is just kind of, I kind of feel like his heart really wasn't in it. At least it feels that way. But he wrote quite a few issues of Thor. So I finished this, and now I am reading this, which is volume 12, which has stories from 82 to 83. These are the last issues of Thor before Walter Simonson returned to the book and began his incredible run on Thor. And man, I can't wait, because these stories are not great so far. Keith Pollard left the book after the first story in this issue. And, well, we've got Alan Kupperberg as the artist. And let's just say he's not terrible, but it's not great. It's not great, especially if you compare it to what came before and what comes after. So I have to read it, though. I have to read every single issue of Thor. So I'm going to finish this Epic Collection. So I read that. That was 118. And then I finished book 119, which, as it turned out, was one of the greatest fantasy novels that I've ever read. It was absolutely fantastic. And that is this book. It's The Broken Sword by Poul Anderson. Poul Anderson, who is probably better known still as a science fiction writer, although he wrote some really great fantasy. And this is just fantastic. This might be the best fantasy that he wrote. It's very dark fantasy. It's well known for being published the same year as the first volume of The Lord of the Rings. This came out the same year that The Fellowship of the Ring came out. And it's interesting because Anderson and Tolkien had a lot of the same influences when they were writing their fantasy novels. And so in a weird way, these have some similarities, but they are very, very different. This is a very dark fantasy. It's one of the darkest fantasies I've read. And it's been enormously influential. Michael Moorcock has cited this as being a very influential book. It influenced his Elric stories. Carl Edward Wagner also cites this as an influence, and you can clearly see the influence of this in Wagner's Cain stories. Another set of really dark fantasy novels and stories, but this is really dark, and which kind of surprised me when I read it. I wasn't expecting that. So just know that about this book. It's a very dark book with some pretty adult themes. You know, there's lots of sex and violence and sexual violence and violence. And there's a lot of that in this book. So, you know, know that going in. You know, if your kid just finishes The Hobbit and wants another fantasy book to read, don't give your kid this. Don't do it. You'll have to pay for therapy for like years. But wonderful book, beautifully written. It's mostly about a war between trolls and elves, but it takes place around the time of the Vikings. And so it takes place in, you know, our history. It's not in Middle Earth or some fantasy land. It's our world that this takes place. Although human beings can't see elves or trolls or other supernatural beings unless they have the witch sight, unless they're given the ability to see elves and dwarves and all of these creatures that exist and have whole societies. And in this story, elves and trolls go to war. The main character's name is Skaflock. Now, Skaflock was taken from his family when he was just a baby. The elves in this story are not like the elves in The Lord of the Rings, say. These elves are sort of immoral. They don't have the same morality that human beings have. And so they will do sneaky things like steal babies and replace them with changelings. And the elf lord, one of the elf lords in this book, he steals Skaflock and replaces him with a baby. And this baby is half troll and half elf, but has been made to look like a human being and is mortal as a human being is. Now, elves and other supernatural beings can just live for centuries. But he's replaced by a character called Valgard. And Valgard, you know, he's a changeling, but he doesn't know as he's growing up that he's a changeling. And while our hero is Skaflock and our villain is Valgard, they're both really interesting characters. I think Valgard actually is probably the most interesting character in this book because he is villainous and he's a bad guy. And you see clearly right away that he's a bad guy as he's growing up in this family, the family of Orm the Strong. But despite being a bad guy, he's sort of complex. And when he's sort of driven to do really bad things, he kind of feels, he feels regret. And he wonders, why am I the way that I am? Because he grows up not knowing that he's a changeling. He doesn't know that he's a half elf, half troll because, he looks human. But, he is inside kind of a monster and does terrible things. He just doesn't know why he does them or why he is the way he is. And he has some affection for the family that he grew up with. But later on in the story, I don't want to give too many spoilers away from this book because it is full of surprises. He does find out what he is, and he has to deal with that, and he has difficulty dealing with it. He's interesting. He's really interesting. And he's probably more interesting than Skaflock, who is the baby who was stolen and raised by elves. So he grows up among the elves, and he becomes a hero among the elves. And eventually he goes to war against the trolls on the elf side. And it's a very bloody, very violent battle. There's a lot of stuff, like I said, that goes on in this book. A lot of shocking things in this book. Like I said, a lot of things I just did not see happening. It was, I just didn't, I didn't expect some of the stuff that came out in this book. And it's just so fantastic. Like I said, beautifully written dark fantasy. One of the best fantasy books I've ever read easily. Probably one of my favorite books. I will definitely read this again. And I've been told this is actually the revised edition from 1971. I've been told by pretty much everybody who's read it that the original edition from 1954, I think it was 54, everybody tells me that that original edition is better. And in fact, Michael Moorcock said, this is not as good as the original version. Well, I don't have the original version. I only had this. So I read this and it was fantastic. One day, after the 500 book challenge is over, I will pick up or try to find a copy of the 54 edition. We'll see if I have luck. I think the Fantasy Masterworks edition is actually the original edition. I'll have to double check, but I think so. So yeah, in a few years, I'll read it again in the original edition, I hope. But this was just fantastic. And I highly recommend this book. I mean, no matter what version it is, it's really, really good. You know, like I said, just don't give it to your kid, you know. So there was that. I read this and it was magnificent. What am I reading right now? Couple things, you know, besides this, I am reading this, but I'm also reading this. This is Captain Blood, Raphael Sabatini's Captain Blood. This is for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. And it also goes right along with that booktube event that's going on now called Spring into Adventure. This is actually Roger's pick for April. And April starts tomorrow. So I started a little early. But this is a book I read years ago when I was in high school. And I'm really enjoying it so far. You know, it's funny about books you read years and years ago. You kind of remember them, but there's always so much stuff that you just forgot. And that's the case with this. And it's really enjoyable. Fantastic adventure novel from what I remember. So I'm reading this for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club and Spring into Adventure. And the adventure will continue after I'm done with Captain Blood, which I will talk more about next week. The next book I'm going to read is probably this one. This is She by H. Rider Haggard. This is one of my favorite books, but since it is Spring into Adventure this month or this coming month, perfect time to read it. So, or reread it. So, She by H. Rider Haggard. And I'm probably going to make this a double feature because I do have this book, which oddly enough, I haven't read. And that's this. This is Aisha, The Return of She. And so, you know, come to think of it, you know, since I'm reading this, might as well follow it up with the sequel. So I probably will do that. This is not that long of a book. So I probably should get to The Return of She as well. So we'll see, but it looks like that's what I'm probably going to do. Has anybody read this? I'm assuming it's not as good as the original. You know, sequels usually aren't, but we'll see. We'll see if it's any good. And I'm also reading this magnificent book, Superman, the Silver Age Omnibus Volume 1. I just read the story that is featured on the cover of this volume, which has the first appearance of Brainiac. Brainiac is my favorite Superman villain in all of Brainiac's many strange different forms. And the art in this book is just beautifully reproduced. It's just such a glorious book of the Silver Age of Superman. And yeah, it just looks great. It's a joy to look at. It's a joy to read. So yeah, I'm reading this. And I'm going to be reading a lot more Superman in the future because Superman is my favorite superhero. He's the best superhero. He is. Anyway, so there's that. I guess that's everything this week. I think so. Yeah, that's everything this week. I will catch you next time.